It was a morning like any other in Vatican City, or so the world thought. But behind those ancient walls, in the corridors where marble floors had felt the steps of saints and sinners alike, something extraordinary was stirring. October 10, 2025. A date that would soon be written into the living memory of the Church. On that grey morning, Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Prevost, the first American ever to sit upon the throne of Peter, prepared to speak words that would shake 2,000 years of tradition. Words that would divide nations, challenge hierarchies, and yet, for some, sound like the whisper of the Holy Spirit itself. Tradition, he said, is not a museum of dead relics, but a living garden that requires pruning. No one could have guessed what those words truly meant. But within minutes, the first American pope in history would reveal reforms so daring, so raw, that even his most trusted cardinals would struggle to breathe. Before the storm began, he had lived in silence. For months after his election in May 2025, following the peaceful death of Pope Francis, Leo XIV observed, listened, and prayed. He was known for quiet strength, a man who preferred depth to spectacle. At 69, with the calm presence of a university professor and the resolve of a missionary, he had walked among the poor of Peru, washed the feet of outcasts, buried the forgotten. And now, he walked through the Vatican's marble corridors carrying a sealed document, 14 decrees that would ignite one of the greatest crises since Vatican II. At his side, Father Antonio Vasquez, his personal assistant, noticed the difference. The Pope's face bore no trace of hesitation, only focus, the serene gravity of a man who has already accepted the cost of his mission. Your Holiness, Cardinal Parolin is waiting, as requested. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes. The words came quietly, but they carried a weight Antonio could not ignore. In the papal office, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State, waited with a look of cautious dread. For decades he had guided popes through crises, but never had he seen such unshakable resolve in a pontiff's eyes. When Leo XIV entered, he did not waste words. Eminence, I have called you because I must share, before the College of Cardinals, the decisions I have made. Parolin inclined his head, though his pulse quickened. On the table lay the sealed folder. Inside, decrees that would alter how the Church lived, breathed, and appeared before the world. Leo XIV broke the seal. The faint crack of wax echoed like thunder. These are the decrees I will sign today. 14 practices and traditions that will be modified, or eliminated. Your Holiness, this is extraordinary. May I express my concern about the reactions it will provoke? Truth has never been popular, Eminence. When Jesus expelled the merchants from the temple, he wasn't applauded either. It was not defiance that drove him, but faith, a conviction that beneath the centuries of ritual and power, the Church's beating heart had grown faint. He sought to clear away the marble dust, to let the Gospel's light breathe again. That afternoon, an extraordinary meeting of the College of Cardinals was called. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Rumors had already begun, whispers of reform, murmurs of scandal. No one, however, was prepared for the truth. The Pope entered. Silence. Even the air seemed to pause. He looked at the faces before him, men of faith, many old, most loyal, some fearful. Then, without preamble, he began. Venerable brothers, after months of prayer and discernment, I have decided to implement reforms necessary for the Church to return to her evangelical roots. 14 traditions and practices will be modified, or eliminated. The first to rise was Cardinal Raymond Burke, the stalwart of conservatism, his face red with disbelief. Your Holiness, with all due respect, should not such changes be submitted to a synod for discussion? The debate has been going on for decades, Eminence. Now is the time for action. I am not here to seek consensus but to guide the Church according to the mandate I have received. A low murmur swept across the hall, unease, anger, awe. The words struck like thunder in the still air. Then came the first announcement. The first change involves the elimination of kissing the papal ring and any form of genuflection before the pontiff. Christ washed the feet of his disciples. We must follow his example of humility, not gestures of medieval submission. The hall exhaled collectively, a gasp, a prayer, a protest. For centuries, the ring had symbolized loyalty to the successor of Peter. Now, in a single sentence, the Pope had dismantled that centuries-old custom. But he wasn't finished. Cardinal Gerhard Müller, former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, rose from his seat, his voice trembling with controlled indignation. Holy Father, some of these traditions date back to the earliest centuries of the Church. Abandoning them would be to betray our sacred heritage. The Church's most sacred heritage, eminence, is not in its traditions but in Christ's message, love, simplicity, service. How many of our customs still reflect these values, and how many have become empty rituals that distance us from the faithful? By the meeting's end, the cardinals were divided. A minority supported him, a majority stood in stunned disbelief. When Cardinal Burke stormed out without offering the customary bow, a centuries-old protocol was shattered. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steady, as if heaven itself wept for what was to come. That evening, behind closed doors, a secret meeting was convened. Among the attendees, Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Robert Serra, and several other conservative voices. The mood was somber, almost conspiratorial. This is nothing short of heresy. He cannot unilaterally change tradition sanctified by centuries of practice. We must prepare a formal dubia. The faithful deserve clarity, and the world deserves to know whether these so-called reforms contradict the eternal teaching of the Church. Outside, in his modest apartment at Casa Santa Marta, Pope Leo XIV kneels before a simple wooden crucifix. The gold and jewels of past ages are absent. Only the dim light of faith fills the room. Lord, give me strength to bear what is to come. You, too, were accused of blasphemy by those who could not see. Let me not waver. He had anticipated resistance. He knew what would follow, accusations of modernism, threats of schism, perhaps even violence. Yet, in that moment of solitude, he felt peace. These reforms were not meant to destroy tradition. They were meant to purify it, to peel away centuries of human ambition that had dimmed the radiant simplicity of the Gospel. October 11, 2025. The world awoke to headlines that blazed across every screen. Pope abolishes 14 ancient traditions. Social media erupted, from jubilation to outrage, from tears of hope to cries of betrayal. In St. Peter's Square, thousands gathered, some clutching rosaries in trembling hands, others holding placards painted hastily overnight, "Long live Leo XIV. Defend the true faith." Security doubled, then tripled. The air vibrated with anxiety. At noon, the papal balcony curtains parted. The crowd hushed, thousands of breaths caught at once. And there he stood, Pope Leo XIV, dressed not in regal robes, but in a simple white cassock, unadorned, pure. No golden stole, no jeweled cross. He raised his hands, not in a royal gesture, but in one of openness, almost an embrace. My beloved brothers and sisters, today we take a step not away from our traditions, but deeper into their true meaning. Behind the curtain, Cardinal Parolin watched nervously. The Vatican's communications team had planned every word, yet no plan could contain what was happening. This was no political maneuver. It was a spiritual earthquake. As the Pope continued, explaining each reform, the hostility in the square began to shift. The fury softened into curiosity, the murmurs into silence. His words were not those of a rebel, but of a shepherd unafraid of wolves. No more princes of the Church. Cardinals would be addressed not as eminence, but simply as brother. No more kissing of rings or kneeling before prelates. No more honorific titles like Monsignor or Excellency. Bishops forbidden from lavish residencies. Funds redirected from ornate liturgical objects to aid the poor. End of private masses for wealthy donors. Bishops required to serve one day each week among the poor. Each pronouncement strikes the air like a bell, clear, undeniable. These changes are not meant to diminish the sacred, but to unveil it. God's presence does not need gold to be recognized. Christ's sacrifice is not made more holy by rituals that few understand. Among them, a young woman whispers through tears. He reminds me of Francis, of Jesus. But not everyone saw holiness. Some saw heresy. Some saw the end of everything they had known. In a small apartment nearby, Cardinal Burke, watching on television, crushed the paper in his hand. His whisper was cold. He is undoing the Church. Then, from somewhere deep in the crowd, a single voice began to sing. Amazing Grace. At first fragile, then joined by another, and another, until the hymn swelled across the square, a river of sound rising toward the heavens. Some wept openly. Others stood motionless, unsure whether they were witnessing a miracle or a tragedy. That night, Rome did not sleep. Wealthy donors announced they were freezing support. Traditional groups organized vigils of reparation. Bishops debated in whispered tones whether the papacy had crossed a line. Yet, amidst the noise, something else stirred, quiet faith rekindled among the ordinary and forgotten. Young Catholics flooded social media with words of gratitude. I feel seen again. I feel Christ is alive in His Church. It was as if the Spirit had breathed through the ashes of centuries, stirring embers long thought cold. That night, as thunder rolled over Rome, Pope Leo XIV prayed alone. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one he had unleashed. He knew the days ahead would bring division, betrayal, and perhaps danger. But as he gazed at the crucifix, Christ, humble and wounded, he whispered the words that had guided every step of his journey. Lord, not my will, but yours. And so began the greatest test of faith the modern Church had ever seen. When the Church is silent, it is not because she is deaf. It is because she is listening. Listening for the breath of God in a world that has forgotten how to breathe. Pope Leo XIV, the world called him the modern Peter, but to those who knew him intimately, he was a man haunted by both vision and silence. He carried the weight of a church standing between the age of miracles and the age of machines. He would often walk at dawn through the Vatican gardens, alone, his fingers brushing the rosary, lips moving silently through mysteries that stretched beyond words. The cardinal said he prayed like one speaking to someone he could see. And perhaps, in a way, he did. On a cold March night, the Pope awoke from a vision. In it, he stood on a cliff overlooking the Tiber River. The moon hung low, vast, red as blood. Below, the city of Rome shimmered like glass, but its reflection was cracked by ripples of darkness. And then, a voice, not thunderous, but sorrowful, whispered, "My church will be wounded not by swords, but by forgetting." He awoke trembling, and when his aide entered the papal chamber, he found Leo kneeling barefoot on the marble floor, whispering, "They are forgetting, even while they build higher." For weeks afterward, he spoke little of the dream, but those around him noticed the change. He began sending letters to bishops across the world, urging them to preserve Eucharistic adoration, to rekindle processions, to teach the young that the host was not symbol, but presence. In a world racing toward industrial perfection, Leo reminded them of divine imperfection, the mystery that breathes. It was 1911. Electric lights flickered through the basilicas for the first time, and the young priests marveled at how bright they shone, as though man had conquered darkness itself. But Leo XIV saw something else. The light of man was swallowing the light of heaven. He once remarked to his confessor, "They will build cities that never sleep, but the soul will grow tired." The crisis came suddenly. Reports arrived from France, from Germany, from even the heart of Rome. The faithful were vanishing from confessionals, the poor no longer came for blessing but for bread. And among the clergy, doubt began to grow like mold in damp stone. One young Monsignor confessed to the Pope himself, "Holy Father, it is not that I have lost faith. It is that I can no longer feel it." The Pope looked at him, not with condemnation but with pity. "Then stay close to the silence, my son. For faith is not always a feeling, sometimes it is the courage to wait in the dark." Among Leo's private writings, discovered decades after his death, there was a sealed envelope. It was addressed simply to the shepherd who will stand at the edge of the last dawn. Inside was a 12-page letter written in trembling Latin. It spoke of a coming century, a century of noise, invention, and confusion, a time when the Church would be tempted to become a voice among voices, when truth would be measured not by holiness but by approval. He wrote, "A day will come when they will make fire fall from their hands and call it progress. But the true fire is the one that burns in the tabernacle." And at the bottom, signed not with his papal seal, but simply, "Servus Christi et Marie, servant of Christ and Mary." Few know this story, but one night, as the records show, a mysterious visitor came to the apostolic palace. It was a nun from Krakow, young, quiet, eyes like twilight. She claimed to have received visions of divine mercy, but at that time, few believed her. Her name, Sister Faustina Kowalska. The year was 1933. Leo XIV was old, his hands shook as he blessed her. She said to him softly, "Holy Father, I saw the Lord, and he told me his mercy will shine through darkness." He looked at her with tears. "Then go, little one. Go, before they close the doors." Years later, the world would remember her visions. But at that moment, the Pope knew, a seed of hope had been planted. There are whispers among Vatican historians that Pope Leo XIV left behind one final prophecy, locked within the archives known as the Silver Codex. Within it was said to be a riddle. When the silver key opens the empty door, and the shepherd walks with no sheep beside him, then heaven will thunder not in anger, but in longing. Some believed it referred to the digital age, the silver key being technology that opens invisible doors between men but leaves their hearts empty. Others thought it meant a future pope who would walk the earth alone, a symbol of the Church purified by suffering. No one truly knows. But the mystery became part of Leo XIV's legend, a man who saw beyond his century. The story goes that one night, in the papal chapel, Leo was praying before the Blessed Sacrament when the host began to darken, turning grey, then black. Panicked, the attendants rushed to him, but the Pope raised his hand. "Do not fear," he said. "The darkness you see is not of God. It is the shadow of man's forgetting." He spent hours before that host, unmoving. When dawn came, it had turned white again. He never spoke publicly of that night. But afterward, he ordered that every chapel in the Vatican renew its perpetual adoration. He said quietly to his secretary, "When the world grows blind, the Church must keep her eyes on the flame." In his final years, Leo XIV withdrew from public appearances. He spent most of his days writing and praying in silence. One afternoon, a small boy from the orphanage was brought to meet him, sickly, frail, dying of fever. The child clutched a crumpled picture of the Sacred Heart and whispered, "Holy Father, will Jesus forget me when I go?" The Pope smiled, tears in his eyes. "He cannot forget you, my child. You are written on his hands." He placed his trembling hand on the boy's forehead and prayed. By morning, the fever had vanished. The doctors called it impossible. The people called it a miracle. Leo called it mercy. On the eve of his passing, he asked for 3 things: the Rosary, the Eucharist, and the sound of the bells from St. Peter's. As they told, he whispered, "The world believes progress means movement. But heaven moves by stillness." He died smiling, facing the tabernacle. When the cardinals entered to prepare his body, they found his personal crucifix glowing faintly, as though reflecting unseen light. No camera captured it. No scientist explained it. But those who were there never forgot. Historians speak of Pope Leo XIV as a bridge between the mystical and the modern. But those who study his writings know he was more than a bridge. He was a signpost, pointing forward, toward a century that would test both faith and humanity. He wrote in his final journal, "They will invent voices to fill the air. They will carry knowledge in their pockets. But they will thirst more than any generation before them. And one day, they will seek again the silence of God and find it waiting." His words, once forgotten, began to resurface in the 21st century, quoted by priests, scholars, and even technologists who wondered if he had somehow foreseen the loneliness of the digital age. And in Rome, deep beneath the Vatican library, there remains a sealed chamber, said to contain the Pope's final notebooks. The archivists call it the Chamber of Breath. No one knows what's written there. But some whisper that within those pages lies a final vision, not of destruction, but of awakening. The story of Pope Leo XIV is not one of despair, but of divine patience. He saw the coming shadows not to frighten, but to prepare. To remind us that holiness is not outdated, it is eternal. And that even in an age of noise, there will always be souls who remember how to listen. Because silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of someone. There is a peculiar thing about prophecy. It does not always speak in thunder. Sometimes, it whispers and waits. For nearly a century, the words of Pope Leo XIV lay buried in archives and memory. Historians dismissed them as the musings of an aging mystic, written at the twilight of a dying world. But time, as heaven often reminds us, is not an enemy of truth, it is its servant. And so, the whispers began again. It began in 2025. A young archivist named Father Matteo Rossi was cataloguing documents in the lower vaults of the Vatican Library when he stumbled upon an unmarked chest, wrapped in decaying velvet. Inside lay a bundle of letters, aged, fragile, sealed with a broken wax crest bearing a simple cross and 2 words. Silentium vincit, silence conquers. The letters were signed by Leo XIV. Father Matteo spent months translating them, his candlelight stretching long shadows across parchment that smelled of incense and centuries. As he read, one phrase appeared over and over. When men forget the taste of bread broken in faith, and drink data instead of wine, the altar will weep. He shuddered. Because, in some strange way, it felt as if the Pope had seen now, the age of screens, of endless noise, of digital communion that left the heart starving. Weeks later, reports began to surface, first from Argentina, then Poland, and then the Philippines. In small parishes, the Eucharist began to manifest a strange phenomenon. During adoration, a faint shimmer appeared on the surface of the host, like dew, glowing with soft light. In one village church, witnesses claimed the host had briefly shown an image, a face both radiant and sorrowful. The Vatican was cautious. No official statements. No rush to declare miracles. But quietly, the Curia convened a commission. Father Matteo was among them. He carried with him the rediscovered letters of Leo XIV, and on the third page of one, written in trembling Latin, was a sentence that froze him. "When light appears on the bread, the dark shall begin to lift." He whispered the words aloud. And for the first time, truly believed the prophecy might not have been symbolic at all. By 2032, the Church faced what many called its age of drift. Attendance dwindled. Doctrines blurred. Faith had become fashionable, or forgotten. But somewhere in that drifting sea, a new figure emerged, Pope John XIV, a man of quiet gaze and disarming simplicity. He refused the grandeur of palaces. He rode in an old Fiat, carried his own cross, and often said, "If the Church forgets the poor, she forgets Christ." He was, in every sense, the heir of Leo XIV, the shepherd of silence in an age that could not stop speaking. When the stories of glowing hosts reached him, he did not dismiss them. He simply said, "Let us listen. Miracles are not spectacles, they are invitations." And so, he began to visit the small parishes himself. No cameras. No entourage. Only prayer. It was Holy Thursday, 2033. In churches across the world, the faithful gathered for adoration. At precisely 11:11 p.m., by no human coordination, thousands of candles flickered into brilliance at once, brighter than flame should burn. In Rome, Pope John knelt before the monstrance in the Vatican chapel. And then, witnesses said, the entire host glowed, not gold, not white, but a living light, pulsing gently like the breath of creation itself. Some fell to their knees. Others wept. The Pope whispered, "Lord, you are here." And at that same hour, the power grids across Europe briefly flickered, not from outage, but from surge. In darkness, cities paused. And for one fleeting moment, silence filled the world. In the weeks that followed, something extraordinary began to happen. People, from every nation, creed, and doubt, began reporting dreams. Dreams of standing in light, of hearing words that were not words but presence. A scientist in Tokyo. A farmer in Brazil. A young girl in Nigeria who said she saw the man dressed in white, holding bread that glowed like the sun. When questioned, she said softly, "He told me not to be afraid. He said, I am still here." The Vatican released no statement. But within its walls, Pope John and Father Matteo sat together reading Leo XIV's final note, the one sealed under the phrase Silentium Vincit. It read, "There will come a night when the world falls quiet not because of fear, but because heaven will speak in silence. Then shall the hearts of men remember." Months later, the Vatican archives opened the long-sealed chamber of breath, where Leo XIV's personal journals had been kept for over a century. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of myrrh. As Father Matteo entered with trembling hands, he saw a single candle still standing beside the desk, untouched, yet unburned. And beside it, a final entry in Leo's hand. If these words are read, know this. The silence was never absence. It was preparation. Every generation must be wounded to awaken. But the wound becomes the doorway through which light enters again. He closed the book, tears falling freely. In that moment, he understood. The prophecy of Leo XIV was not about destruction or doom. It was about return, the return of hearts to the living presence, to the sacred stillness from which all creation began. The following year, something remarkable occurred. A world-renowned radio station, broadcasting live from Rome, suddenly went silent for exactly 3 minutes. No static. No voice. No malfunction. Just silence. And in that silence, millions listening across the globe reported feeling a deep calm, a sense of being seen, known, held. Later investigations revealed nothing unusual. But on the same day, Pope John wrote a single message on social media, just one line. The world heard him again today. By 2040, people began making pilgrimages not just to famous shrines, but to small, forgotten churches, those with old tabernacles, cracked pews, and quiet air. There was no spectacle. No marketing. Only silence and presence. In those humble places, miracles began to multiply, healings, conversions, reconciliations between old enemies. Not dramatic, but deep. Like roots growing beneath the earth. The Church did not call it revival. It called it remembrance. And the phrase once written by Leo XIV became a universal motto. Silentium vincit. Silence conquers. Before his passing, Pope John XIV revealed one final story to his secretary. He said that on the night of the 1,000 lights, as the host glowed before him, he saw, just for a moment, a man standing beside the altar. A frail, ancient figure in white, eyes shining with unshed tears. The man placed his hand upon the monstrance and whispered, "You have done what I could not." And then he was gone. The Pope wept. Because he knew who it was. Leo XIV, the Pope who had dreamed of this moment a century before. He smiled, looking up at the host, and said softly, "The silence is no longer empty." He died that night, at peace. Centuries will pass. Nations will rise and fall. Faith will waver, then return. But through it all, one truth will remain. God does not shout. He whispers. And in the whisper, the faithful will always find him. In the Eucharist, in the poor, in the stillness between heartbeats. Because silence was never a void. It was the pulse of heaven. So perhaps Leo XIV was not warning us after all. Perhaps he was reminding us that even in an age of noise, the holiest sound is still the sound of one heart turning toward God. And maybe, just maybe, that is how heaven will return. Not with trumpets, but with a breath. Today, in the archives of the Vatican, the letters of Pope Leo XIV rest in glass. Pilgrims come not to touch them, but to listen. They say when you stand near the case, if the air is still, you can hear a faint hum, like the sound of distant prayer. And for those who stay long enough, that hum begins to echo in their own chest. Because some words never die. They simply wait for the world to grow quiet enough to hear them again. If you have heard this story tonight, pause for a moment before you move on. Let the silence breathe. Let the stillness speak. And remember, he is still here.